for the introductions. So I'd like to start with just kind of what the year in review report is in general. So Dragos's year in review report highlights threats, vulnerabilities, assessments, and insights from this past year to help provide ICS practitioners information on the threat landscape and how to address challenges the industry faces as a whole. It is the team's goal to share information we've learned over time with the industrial community for data-driven analysis and recommendations. So we released two reports. One is a full comprehensive report, and the other is an executive summary kind of geared towards that, C-level suite executives. And that's really boiled down to highlight the critical information. But it is our fourth year providing this report, and I personally find comparing and contrasting between the years to be pretty interesting, and that's something we're going to touch on later in this presentation. So this is the third webinar in our year in review series focused on examining ICS vulnerabilities. We had previous webinars on ICS threats and lessons learned from the field, so please check those out if you're interested. But in this talk, we're going to specifically highlight the vulnerability section of the report. We're going to talk about how we gathered and performed analysis on the vulnerabilities, how publicly released security advisories can be incorrect or incomplete at times, and how the vulnerability data set that we've collected has changed between the years and what that means for the industrial landscape. So next slide, please.
So a little bit about the data set that we've been looking at. As Sam said, we've been doing this analysis for quite a few years now. We have a lot of advisories and vulnerability data now in our database. So year over year, there's actually been a pretty big increase. I mean, the number of advisories that were coming out year over year, it seems to always be going up as more researchers get interested in the industrial space. But I think that this year has finally kind of hit this interesting milestone. We had 253 advisories that were kind of ICS relevant with a total of 703 vulnerabilities. So that means that we're getting almost 3 vulnerabilities in each advisory that's published. But I think the most interesting data set from that statistic is that, there are 52 weeks in a year. When you have 250 advisories, that is just over 1 advisory per working day. So if you have a 5-day work week, you're having to deal with 1 of these advisories per working day. It's getting to be a bit much for one person to really handle. And here at Dragos, we've expanded our vulnerability analyst team quite a bit over the last year to kind of reflect that. We've had a few new hires that we'll mention later in the talk. But I think that was kind of an interesting data point just on its own, how many advisories we're having to deal with. So each week we go through all of the advisories that have come out that have some ICS relevance, and we take a look at them. We may correct some mistakes that were in the advisory as far as CVSS scores and that sort of thing, and we'll talk about what that looks like, as well as augment those advisories with some additional information. And of course, each week we're going back and looking at advisories that came out, earlier in the year and in years past, and saying, has there been any update on this? Has the vendor, maybe the vendor put out a partial patch for a previous advisory that now there's an additional update for, or maybe some researcher has gotten around to publishing proof of concept exploit code for an advisory that may have come out, in the last year or in years past. So we tend to look at those and update our previous advisories in our database as well, so that information is available for folks to take a look at.
So to demonstrate the state of ICS vulnerabilities, I'd like to start with the graph on the very left. So 23% of vulnerabilities that Dragos analyzed applied to products bordering the enterprise. So this can include networking, communication equipment. It can include VPNs, data historians, firewalls, systems that are commonly deployed near or around ICS networks. And ICS targeting adversaries, including Venadinite and Parasite, have historically leveraged these vulnerabilities and assets for initial access to target environments, and certainly do pose a risk to industrial operators. On the other hand, 77% of these vulnerabilities can be found deep within ICS networks. So that's systems that can be found in level 1, 2, and 3 of the Purdue model approximately. So these are systems like PLCs, instrumentation, engineering or operator systems, etc. So this breakdown of where vulnerabilities resides help us understand where researchers are focusing their attention and what parts of industrial networks are being more closely examined and where maybe their systems are being potentially overlooked. But moving to the graph in the middle, the percentage of disclosed flaws that could be used to cause a loss of view and loss of control in ICS systems decreased significantly from 50% in 2019 to 36% in 2020. So this decrease is likely attributed to the increase in identified vulnerabilities bordering the enterprise that do not have direct operational impact. So we've seen a lot of these vulnerabilities make headlines in products such as F5's Big IP firewall or Fortinet's VPN appliances, Palo Alto's PAN-OS, systems like that. So it's quite rare to have a vulnerability only impact view or only impact control. It's usually a both or nothing type of thing. So finally, the graph on the very right shows an increase in advisories and individual vulnerabilities that contained errors. So 2020 had an increase of 13% over 2019. So that's a total of 43% of advisories that contained incorrect data. And this could inadvertently mislead practitioners who use the Common Vulnerability Scoring System for mitigation or patching, especially when 73% of those advisories with incorrect data had more severe scores in the context of an operational environment than the original public advisory claimed. So next slide, please, unless you want to add something, Reid.
I was just thinking more about this loss of view and loss of control and the change year over year. I think one of the things that we had been looking at internally, the reason that there was a change, a major change in impacts that caused loss of view and loss of control, I think there were more licensing systems and kind of engineering workstations that were investigated in 2020. Does that sound about right, Sam? I think we had a bunch more of that. So when like an engineering workstation application, for example, has a vulnerability in it, that doesn't immediately give an attacker the ability to cause a loss of view or loss of control, right? An attacker can use that point on the network to possibly impact operations, but from that, just exploiting that vulnerability, they don't actually get loss of view or loss of control. And that's kind of a reason that we see a big decrease year over year in that statistic from 50% to 36%. It was kind of a weird statistic to me because I was like, why is this the case? But it's great because you can start digging through the data and kind of figure out, what's actually causing it. So with that in mind, we're looking at advisories and saying, what are the actual industrial impacts that come from these advisories? Well, one of the other things that we like to look at is whether an advisory has what I call actionable data in it. And those that have seen me speak on this subject probably know what I'm about to say. But there are a lot of advisories that come out every year that don't have any practical mitigation advice, which is, there are advisories that come out right now. I think in 2019 to 2020 or 2020, there were very similar statistics as far as how many advisories came out that had a patch available, but there were also very similar statistics for, if they had a patch available, did they also provide mitigation advice? Like, these are ports that you can block, or these are file extensions that you can look for, or maybe some Windows hardening guidelines that you can apply in order to kind of mitigate the vulnerability if you can't patch. So we actually saw some improvement if there was a patch available. We actually saw more of those advisories also including that alternate mitigation advice. But unfortunately, if there was no patch available, we saw a slight increase in advisories that had no mitigation advice. And again, if there's no patch available and there's no alternate mitigation advice, you have to ask yourself, what is the point of the advisory? It's kind of like, hey, you're vulnerable. There's no patch. There's no, we're not going to give you any guidance for what you can do to reduce your risk. So it's kind of like, good luck, have fun, I guess, is what you're supposed to do in an advisory like that. I don't consider that to be really even an advisory, since it's not giving you any advice. But that's kind of an interesting to look at this year over year. I would love to see these numbers improve more with time, but they are what they are. I hope that we do better in the future. And so kind of along that line, we look at what is actionable. A couple of years ago, there was a talk at the S4 Security Conference by Art Mannion, and it was part of Dale Peterson's talk on how can we replace CVSS. And CVSS, as we know, is this both numeric score as well as gobbledygook string that tells you what inputs or what prerequisites an attacker needs to exploit a system, as well as what the expected outputs of exploitation are. And the problem is that that number is kind of meaningless because you really have to apply your threat model to it. So Art Manion gave this talk where he basically said, I want to come out with 3 outputs from my score. It's either I'm going to patch or mitigate this thing now, I'm going to patch or mitigate this thing at my next available opportunity, or I'm just going to completely ignore this advisory and not take any action. So internally, if you've read our reports, we have 2 extra gradations of scoring that really apply more to news items than to vulnerabilities. But we have these 3 that we really use for vulnerabilities. And those would be our immediate action, what you could equate to Art Manion's now. We also have a limited threat, which basically means, hey, this is probably going to apply to a lot of people, but it does require some analysis, and applying the mitigation might require some downtime. I think that would roughly equate to Art's next category. And then we also have this kind of, it's a possible threat, but it's really unlikely. If you have this system, take a look at your network, but you really probably don't have to worry about this. And like I said, we do have 2 extra categories too. One of those is kind of a white informational flag that we attach to advisories, although that's more with news items. I think we usually apply that to things like, hey, there is this potential legislation coming down that, there's nothing that you have to do today, but this is something that you want to pay attention to. We also have a hype warning that we apply, or a hype label that we apply to some things. I think we may have applied this to vulnerabilities sometimes over the years, but it's pretty rare. But it would be if somebody is really playing up some issue that really is a big nothing burger. Yeah, there's that. But I think what was interesting was, we apply the kind of next, now, never labeling to our internal advisories. And we're actually consistently coming up with about 7% of security advisories year over year that would have the immediate action label. To me, that's kind of a good thing, right? Because going back to that how many advisories are coming out each year, 253 advisories. Well, if you can see that only 18 of those advisories really require you to drop everything and handle them, well, that's starting to become more feasible, right? You can actually have like a person or 1 or 2 people that runs around the plant and says, okay, once every couple of weeks, there's a big security advisory come out. Let's take a look at our asset inventory and figure out if we need to shore up firewall rules or do some other mitigation to kind of put that into place.
So as mentioned previously, 43% of public advisories analyzed by Dragos contained incorrect data of some kind. So I'd like to go over a specific example and look at one of Dragos's advisories to compare and contrast with. So the screenshot on the right is an example advisory the Dragos analyst team put together, highlighting an issue in Mitsubishi Electric's Malsec IQR series of PLCs. So in this specific vulnerability, successful exploitation allows, successful exploitation allows an adversary to cause a denial of service condition in the PLC and requires physical intervention to resume normal operations. So I'd specifically like to highlight the score published in the original advisory, which has still yet to be updated, shows the vulnerability has a low effect on availability. So Dragos analysts strongly disagree with this assessment. A vulnerability that completely halts a PLC and requires physical access to resume operations would be indicative of a high severity vulnerability. Further, the original advisory had no mention of what ports were affected, didn't really include actionable intelligence that operators or engineers could take to mitigate this vulnerability, and made no mention of the operational impact successful exploitation could have. So often these public advisories are kind of bare bones snippets of information, which commonly can contain errors and are minimally helpful to the people who need to take action. So they're not really geared towards vulnerability prioritization and rarely include remediation steps. So next slide, please. So for operators and practitioners, the two key pieces of information that they want to know is what advisories should I pay attention to first and what action needs to be taken. Often the public advisories don't really state this in a clear way. For example, and as mentioned prior, the CVSS fails to include operational impact and uses this kind of generic numeric system that can have misleading or flawed effects, and which may guide an operator into wrongly prioritizing these vulnerabilities. However, the Never Next Now scale we've adopted tries to incorporate the impacts a vulnerability can have that OT practitioners would care about, such as operational impact or system relevancy. And for mitigation, most public advisories simply say to patch as soon as possible. However, as you all know, in industrial systems, it's not really that simple. Systems and critical infrastructure can't just randomly go down to be patched when a severe vulnerability gets announced. Instead, a better way would be to include actionable steps practitioners can take besides patching. So this would include port information if it's network exploitable, or file extensions that may be used during exploitation, which practitioners can monitor for, and other general recommendations that can help make systems just a bit more secure. So our team really tries to help fill in the missing gaps in public advisories by double checking and correcting the scores if needed, having clear prioritization guidance using the Never Next Now system, and including what operational impact there may be, so asset owners and operators know what to do to mitigate these issues and they know how to do it. Let's see, next slide.
Yeah, and I guess there was kind of a question in the Q&A chat. Keep them coming. I mean, one of them was like, hey, if there's a patch available, like, why do we need to provide that alternate mitigation advice? And the answer there is really, it's all about downtime. Because if you're going to patch a PLC, for example, you really need your plant to be offline for that patch, because that PLC may be executing some logic that you really need to be online all the time. Whereas if you can have some alternate mitigation advice that says, hey, there is this proprietary network port, and only your engineering workstation needs to communicate on that port. Well, now you can go to a firewall and actually apply that rule and say, hey, I've got my engineering workstations group of computers, only allow them to contact this group of PLCs on this particular TCP port. And then you don't actually have to shut anything down. You can get some protection. I'm not saying that it's perfect, but I'm saying it's at least minimizing exposure of the vulnerable component to protect it. So I guess our call to action, to kind of wrap things up, would be, vendors, we'd really love to have more advisories that explain the industrial impact. Like, we see a lot of these advisories come out where a vendor describes a problem, and this is especially, down at the low levels of the network, PLCs, other field devices, where they say, oh, it's, denial of service. Well, the question that I always have is denial of service. Well, what does that mean? If it's a web application that sits on a PLC, and you can crash the web application, but the PLC continues to execute logic, like, as an end user, I actually don't care. If it's still actually going to execute ladder logic, I'd say, hey, crash the web application, unless it's, of course, being used for an HMI or something like that. But most of these PLCs, they have web applications that are just used for kind of initial configuration. So crashing that web application actually makes the device better. Hey, now it's not, wasting a bunch of CPU time dealing with HTTP requests. Instead, it's just executing ladder logic. But this idea of providing alternate mitigation advice is something else that vendors really have to do. And you see this actually with some vendors where they're now publishing security documents that basically say, hey, if you're deploying our control systems, here are all of the components, protocol names, port numbers that are associated with comms, and these are what workstations need to communicate with what ports. If you're a vendor, definitely make that list, because you can refer to that document in any security advisory that you publish. Then you can say, hey, this PLC turns out has a vulnerability in the XYZ protocol. Look to our document to see what systems must communicate using that protocol. And you don't have to write anything else into your advisory, right? You can just have a reference, and then you get the little checkbox in our database that says, hey, you provided alternate mitigation advice. Good job. And our circles change shape for the better year over year. For researchers, I would say, I've had a lot of conversations with vulnerability researchers over the years. and they're always super helpful. And I love talking to folks in the community. Double check those scores. I know I'm guilty of this too. When you find a vulnerability, you submit it to ICS cert or submit it to the vendor, you get back an advisory, hey, this is cool. Hey, it's got my name on it. This is really nice. But we tend not to pay as much attention to that CVSS score or any of the information in the advisory almost. And a lot of times that info can end up being wrong. And sometimes we notice it and we kind of argue back and forth with vendors. And sometimes we win and sometimes they win. But definitely double check those scores. I've had a lot of conversations with researchers where I say, hey, does this score match reality? Because maybe you wrote a blog post on this and like the public advisory doesn't seem to line up with what the blog post says. And usually, the public advisory turns out to be wrong, meaning that the researcher knows what they're talking about. They wrote the blog post, they found the vulnerability. But yeah, getting that score correct in the public advisory can certainly help us. And I'd love to see more deep diving into industrial protocols. I'll say this probably every year. We see a ton of vulnerabilities in web applications, SNMP, even TCP stacks. There's not a lot of deep dives into actual industrial protocols. We're seeing a little more of it. In the last year, I think we've seen a couple of really good Ethernet IP SIP kind of Rockwell automation vulnerabilities that have come out. There have also been a lot of deep dives into proprietary extensions to Modbus in the last year. But there's still not a whole lot of coverage of people like really exploring industrial protocols. And for end users, I guess my advice is, as we see this upward trend continue, this is helps you make a case for more bodies. As I said, we have more than one advisory per day for a full-time employee, especially if you're planning to take a vacation at any time during the year. You're going to have to be dealing with even more advisories when you come back. So you might need to hire more and make a bigger team, and definitely start getting a handle on asset inventory and that sort of thing, so you can figure out what systems really or what steps you should take when advisories come out. And I think all of us, I would love to see more movement in this kind of now, next, never direction with advisories, because I think Sam can join me on this. We're all getting a little tired of the CVSS gobbledygook, especially with industrial advisories, where it's like, well, yeah, there's this advisory and it's like high severity, it's CVSS 8.6, but it turns out it's like theft of some key that doesn't actually do anything because the PLC is insecure by design to begin with. So what is even the point? Like a real attacker wouldn't even have to exploit anything in order to gain access to the controller. So I guess kind of a special thanks. We have kind of a back-end team. I know Kate, she's my boss. She's been on this call answering people's questions in the Q&A and chat. We also have Jake Baines, who's a person who joined our team in November. He's a super talented researcher, and there will be a ton of awesome advisories coming out from him in the coming weeks, as well as Lulu, who's been doing a ton of like back-end database management and data entry for our vulnerability database, making sure that we have coverage, going back to, I think, 2002 at this point, maybe even before. So we have a lot of advisories in the database now. And of course, researchers that we've reached out to over the years. I think, Sam, you've probably reached out to some people too with questions. The community has always been super responsive, and I love it. You reach out to vuln researchers, they love to talk shop. So it's always really helpful for, getting the right data. And of course, vendors, same thing. There are a couple of vendors who are super helpful and super responsive. You all know who you are. I won't call you out by name so that nobody gets in trouble. But there are quite a lot of people, some of whom may be on this call, but who are great about answering questions when we have them about advisories in their products. We'll be answering some questions on the chat. We'll see what we can answer live too. But if you have any follow-up questions or more involved ones, you can always email us, intel@dragos.com. You can reach Sam on Twitter @SecureLoon and me on Twitter @ReverseICS. And finally, we have another webinar coming up on April 28th. It's a demo of the Dragos platform. Check it out. It'll be the same time, but on Wednesday in 2 weeks. So you can sign up at the URL below. And let's see, what questions have we got? Looks like some of these have been answered already. What do we think about the recent DNS stack vulnerabilities? So those are kind of interesting. You know, a lot of these embedded system advisories have come out, and there have been a bunch of them that affect these embedded operating systems, the Trek stack, I'm trying to remember, there's like Nucleus RTOS and a couple of others. They're, on the one hand, they're super interesting because I love all of this, you know, what components go into a product, you know, these sort of third-party components that go into a product to you know, make the sausage. But on the other hand, you don't see a whole lot of active exploitation, you know, and I don't know that you ever will, just because, well, you know, to go after an embedded product, especially in the industrial space, you have to say, all right, what's the underlying operating system? What is the memory layout in the device? And you know, these are usually memory corruption bugs. So knowing the address space layout, the CPU architecture, and a bunch of other details, it takes a lot of research to kind of figure out all of that and to make a working exploit, generally speaking. And I just don't think we're ever going to see widespread exploitation of those devices. Now, if that ever does happen, that is actually sort of a good sign, because right now, I mean, this is, we have so many insecure by design components on control systems networks, where it's like, well, yeah, you could exploit the buffer overflow and get remote or, you know, arbitrary code execution, but you can also use the BACnet protocol to just shut the device off, or use it to, you know, reconfigure some settings in the controller. So I just don't see them being like super exploited in the wild, just given the kind of prerequisites for exploitation. So do you have any questions you're dying to answer there, Sam?
So here's one that should be pretty straightforward to answer. So are you considering looking at vulnerabilities based on ICS sector, or just keeping all of them lumped together? So we look at vulnerabilities, any that impact ICS, specifically critical infrastructure. We don't really focus on medical too much, but, and we do in our advisories specifically mention what sector they're a part of, whether it be electric or critical manufacturing or whatever. Those will be mentioned and tagged, so that if you are a subscriber to our worldview, you can actually search by infrastructure, so, and by sector. So those are available to our customers.
We have another one that was knowing that there's no alternative mitigation in a lot of advisories, and that number is actually increasing slightly between 2019 and 2020. Are there any network-based mitigations like application layer firewalls that users can use? And we shy away from like recommending specific products, but a lot of times, like in our versions of advisories, we will, you know, suggest like, hey, here are some additional informations that you can use. So a lot of these PLCs that have like proprietary extensions to Modbus, for example, you know, Schneider Electric is obviously a big one. They use this special function called function code 90. We looked at one recently where we published an advisory. It's another product called T-Box, where they use a couple of proprietary function codes for managing security as well as managing the executed ladder logic project file. We mention those function codes where we can, because that can be useful in third-party firewalls. But you know, other than publishing some vulnerability reports on firewalls, which I think we've got 1 or 2 in the works at this point, we shy away from, you know, recommending a specific product. We just try to provide the detail that, you know, hey, if you use, you know, product X, you could say, hey, you know, only allow the engineering workstations to use this proprietary function code, whether it's like 99 or 90 or whatever the function code happens to be. And looks like we're pretty much on time. We'll take a look at the rest of these questions and see if we can publish a kind of a follow-up blog post or something like that to this. And of course, if you guys have other questions that we haven't answered, again, shoot us an email or reach out to us on Twitter. We'd be happy to answer it. Thanks everybody for joining the webinar, and there'll be a recording of this so you can grab it and watch it again later.
Thanks, folks.